Hey, welcome to our next series called WiLD Conversations. WiLD, in a WiLD Leaders context, it stands for Whole and Intentional Leader Development. But I also want to suggest to you that that concept of whole and intentional leader development is a WiLD proposition. And let me tell you why. When you think about things that are wild in your world, the term wild is oftentimes described as something that is not based on sound reasoning or probability. It's something that's beyond surprising, possibly undeserved, as opposed to something that's not wild, or the opposite of wild, be something that is cultured, relevant, sensible, or disciplined, and within convention. And isn't it amazing when you hear someone use the term wild, how oftentimes, when you hear that, there's something to pay attention to when someone says, I had a wild experience today. Because you know that it was something that was surprising or beyond their normal conventions. And I want to suggest to you that the journey into what it means to be whole and intentional about our learning and development is a WiLD proposition, because it involves some things that are difficult for us to talk about in certain kinds of organizational contexts. Let me go down that route. And let me just specifically focus on business for a moment. When you look at the literature on the leadership development journey of folks across all kinds of leadership contexts, it is a wild story, because it involves some things that are much more difficult to put on our radar, but just as important as anything else. And so I'd love for you to think about for just a moment. I'm going to give you a list of words that are oftentimes within a business context. Now, it might be different if you're in a nonprofit context, but in a business context, some words that are within convention that probably won't prompt much for you if you work in that setting. Success, security, strategy, solutions, and what's happening on the surface. Those things probably don't prompt anything for you. Now I want you to imagine if you actually prompted or instigated a conversation within your work setting that involved these kinds of things. And pay attention to what happens inside of you when you imagine actually doing this, creating a conversation that connected all those other things to this set of words. Family, personal finances, faith, failures, and even feelings. So for some of us, if you really put yourself in the shoes of bringing those kinds of conversations into organizations, you get a little bit of a knot in your stomach. If you don't get any kind of a knot, by the way, around those words and you work in a business context, you're either doing this really well or you are blind to some of the things that people are actually thinking about. Because the wild conversation, the reality is that so many of us live we are like wild beasts in a sensible world, because we have this conversation going on around the things that we are feeling, around things that we believe that we can't prove, around our families, and the real story that's happening that's affecting our ability to show up well in our work context that is really going on. So what I would challenge you to think about today as we begin this series of wild conversations is to think about this. What are the things today that you're labeling as wild? Just look for the word. Listen for when people today describe something as wild. We know that when someone describes something that way, it's probably something to pay attention to that's important, to create some intentional around and to open up a better conversation.